If you keep having the same argument over and over in your relationship, there may be something important happening beneath the surface. You may think you're arguing about money, or chores, or parenting, or sex, or how much time someone spends on their phone, or the tone of voice your partner used at breakfast. But sometimes the subject of the argument isn't really the issue. Sometimes the reoccurring argument is a lesson that keeps showing up because something important hasn't been understood yet. Think about how school works. You take a test, you get an F, and eventually the class moves on. Monday, you fail the test on fractions. Tuesday, everybody starts learning decimals. The educational system doesn't usually say, well, we're going to keep giving you this exact test every Thursday for the next 15 years until you finally figure it out. No. Life, unfortunately, seems to have a different curriculum. In life, when we don't learn something, guess what? The lesson has a strange tendency to come back again. And you've been living it. For how many years? The answer is you've lost track. Different day, different circumstances, sometimes even a different relationship. But strangely enough, a familiar test shows up again. And nowhere is this more obvious than in our closest relationships. You may have had the same argument 500 times. Maybe your partner feels criticized and you feel ignored. Maybe your partner withdraws and you pursue. Maybe you become overwhelmed and shut down while your partner becomes increasingly desperate to get some kind of response from you. Eventually, both people start thinking, why are we still talking about this? Should I even be with this person? That's an important question, because perhaps the goal isn't to finally win an argument. Perhaps the goal is to discover what the argument has been trying to teach you. Imagine a couple, I'm going to call them David and Rachel. They've been married for 18 years. And they have what they jokingly call the Saturday argument. It usually begins with something completely ordinary. Rachel asks David if he's going to finish something around the house. David hears criticism in her voice and immediately becomes defensive. I said I'd do it. Rachel responds, I'm just asking. David says, no, you're not. You're reminding me because you think I'm irresponsible. Rachel becomes frustrated and she says, why does everything I say turn into an argument? And David walks away and forgets to do the chore. Rachel follows him because she doesn't want the conversation left unresolved. And David becomes overwhelmed because now he feels cornered. Rachel becomes increasingly emotional because now she feels abandoned. And within 10 minutes, they aren't discussing the leaky faucet anymore. They're discussing the entire marriage. Now, by lunchtime, David feels attacked and Rachel feels completely alone. And here's the fascinating part. Both people leave the argument believing the other person caused it. So neither person learns anything. And guess what? Next Saturday, life hands them the same damn test again. And they fail it again. The faucet becomes the electric bill. The electric bill becomes a parenting decision. The parenting decision becomes holiday plans. The content changes. The pattern doesn't. The lesson is still right there in your face. That's one of the most important things to understand about recurring relationship conflict. If you focus only on the subject, you completely miss the pattern. The real question isn't, what are we arguing about? The better question is, what happens between us every time we argue? Because underneath recurring arguments, there's a deeper emotional theme. One person may be trying to learn how to speak up without attacking. The other may need to learn how to listen without immediately defending. One person may need to learn that disagreement isn't rejection. Another may need to learn that needing space doesn't mean abandoning the relationship. Someone may need to learn boundaries. Someone may need to learn flexibility. Someone may need to learn how to apologize without explaining away the apology. And someone may need to learn how to ask directly for reassurance instead of creating conflict in order to get it. And sometimes both people are being asked to learn something at the same time. That's what makes intimate relationships such powerful classrooms. Your partner has an extraordinary ability to bump into parts of you that nobody else can reach. A coworker could criticize you, and you might shrug it off. Your spouse gives you one particular look across the kitchen, and suddenly, your nervous system is reacting like civilization itself is collapsing. Why? Because intimate relationships touch old wounds. They activate fears of abandonment, rejection, inadequacy, control, humiliation, invisibility, and failure. That means some arguments aren't just happening between two adults standing in the kitchen. No, the past has quietly snuck into the room. One person may be reacting to something that happened 10 minutes ago. The other may be reacting to something that happened 20 years ago, and neither person realizes it. That's when an argument becomes bigger than the situation deserves. So, when you notice yourself becoming intensely reactive, try asking yourself a powerful question. Okay, what does this remind me of? Not intellectually, but emotionally. When have I felt this feeling before? Maybe your partner's silence reminds you of growing up with a parent who withdrew affection. Maybe criticism reminds you of a childhood where nothing you did was quite good enough. Maybe emotional intensity reminds you of growing up in a chaotic household, so the moment someone raises their voice, your nervous system says, I got to get out of here. Maybe being ignored reminds you of spending years feeling invisible. Suddenly, the argument makes a little more sense now, doesn't it? You're not crazy. No. Your nervous system has simply recognized an old pattern and is trying to protect you again. But protection strategies that helped us survive earlier situations most often damage our adult relationships. Defensiveness may once have protected you. Withdrawal may once have protected you. Even people-pleasing may have once protected you. Even anger may have protected you. Emotional shutdown protected you. But adulthood occasionally asks us to retire strategies that used to work, and they've outlived their usefulness now. Life has a rather annoying teaching method. It keeps giving us opportunities to practice whether we want those opportunities or not. So imagine that you're having the same argument again. Instead of thinking, oh boy, here we go again, try thinking, oh, here's another test again. Maybe I can pass it this time. That tiny shift changes your position. You become curious instead of automatically reactive. You can ask yourself, what would passing this test look like? Maybe passing the test means not raising your voice this time. Maybe it means staying in the conversation instead of disappearing emotionally. Maybe it means taking a 20-minute break before saying something you'll regret. Maybe it means saying, I'm kind of getting defensive, but I want to understand what you're trying to tell me, so give me a brief timeout and I'll be back. Maybe it means saying, I need some reassurance right now, and I'm having trouble asking for it. Maybe passing the test means setting a boundary you've been afraid to set. And sometimes passing the test means realizing that you've been trying to solve a problem that isn't even yours to solve. That's pretty important. Learning the lesson doesn't mean tolerating mistreatment. It doesn't mean becoming endlessly patient while someone else refuses accountability. It doesn't mean accepting abuse, manipulation, contempt, or repeated betrayal. Sometimes the lesson is precisely the opposite. Sometimes the lesson is learning to say, this isn't acceptable anymore. Sometimes the lesson is recognizing that love and boundaries belong in the same sentence. Sometimes the lesson is understanding that you can't do another person's emotional work for them. And sometimes the lesson is finally learning the difference between helping someone and rescuing them. But whatever the lesson happens to be, you usually recognize it when your response begins to change. Because here's the interesting thing about these recurring tests. You don't pass the test by changing the other person. You pass the test by changing how you show up. Suppose your partner says something that normally sends you into orbit. You feel that familiar surge. Ego steps into the equation. Your heart speeds up. Your muscles tighten. Your mind immediately begins preparing its closing argument for the Supreme Court. And then you notice it. Oh, there it is. There's that pattern again. And instead of doing what you've done the previous 100 times, you do something slightly different. You slow down. You become curious. You say, I think we're falling into our usual pattern again. That sentence can be incredibly powerful because now the two of you aren't enemies standing on opposite sides of the problem. You're partners looking at the pattern together. Instead of you versus me, it becomes us versus that damn cycle. That's a completely different relationship. Now, don't expect perfection. Sometimes growth is surprisingly unimpressive. Maybe last year your arguments lasted 3 days. Now they only last 3 hours. That's growth. Maybe you used to say 10 hurtful things in a day. Now you only say 2. Still not ideal, but it's still growth. Maybe you used to shut down for an entire weekend. Now you say, I kind of need 30 minutes, but I promise I'll come back and finish this conversation. That's enormous growth right there. We often imagine emotional maturity as reaching some peaceful state where nothing bothers us anymore. That's probably not going to happen. Emotional maturity is more often the ability to notice what's happening inside us before automatically acting it out. And relationships give us endless opportunities to practice. So the next time you find yourself thinking, I can't believe we're having this argument again, Try asking 3 other questions. What is the pattern underneath this argument? What is this situation asking me to learn? And what could I do differently this time? Then try something new. Not because your partner necessarily deserves a different response, not because you're admitting that everything is your fault, but because you deserve to stop repeating patterns that are hurting you. You can't control whether your partner learns their lesson. You can't control whether they grow. You can't control whether they apologize, change, become more emotionally available, or finally understand something you've explained 500 times. But you can learn your part. And sometimes something remarkable happens when one person changes their part of the dance. The dance itself begins to change. The old argument tries to start, but it can't quite find the same rhythm. Someone doesn't take the bait. Someone stays curious. Someone asks a different question. Someone sets a healthier boundary. Someone listens instead of preparing a rebuttal. And suddenly, the old test produces a different result. Life is going to continue giving you tests. There's going to be patience tests, boundary tests, forgiveness tests, tests on courage, communication, self-respect, and occasionally the dreaded test titled, "Can you let this go without explaining your point one more time?" That one appears to be an advanced course, but maybe the recurring conflicts in your life aren't evidence that you're failing. Maybe they're invitations. Maybe life keeps bringing certain situations back because there's something inside them worth discovering. So if you've been having the same arguments for 5, 10, 15, 25, 50 years, don't only ask, how do I make my partner stop doing this? Ask something deeper. What is this pattern trying to teach me? Because once you truly learn the lesson, once you finally get it, something changes. Sometimes your partner changes. Sometimes the relationship changes. Sometimes your boundaries change. And sometimes you change. And occasionally you realize something even more powerful. The test came back. But this time, you're not the same person taking it. Please like, subscribe. See you tomorrow. Would you like to schedule a paid private coaching session? This will be in the form of a face-to-face Zoom call. Underneath any of my videos, you'll see this Calendly link. If you click on that link, it'll open up my calendar. You can pick the available days and times that works for your schedule, and I will be available on that exact day and time, and we will talk.